In that case, good luck, welcome. Tonight is round one of the newest semester. I hope you have your cards from the registrar over there. Dr. Feinberg should be here somewhere. I look around and I see mostly people. I don't have to explain what this is all about. So we're just picking up, once again, draw a microscopic light on a very small period of Jewish history, which happens to be, as you know, with the Yom Kippur War, a big one. This year I hope to cover where we picked up last time. I call this Hubris and Atonement, State of Israel and Jewish people, 72, 75. That's 72, 73, 74, and 75. Those years, as I see, nobody here was alive at that time, right? So tonight, we're starting a series called Hubris and Atonement. For those of you who don't know what hubris is, get a dictionary. But I think it does fit this period. And all joking aside, I think many of us are able to remember that. What a big blow it was when the war hit. So it's almost it has a Greek proportions to it, does it not? The Hubris and Atonement. Baruch Hashem, happy ending, sort of, but it was a tough business. When we all came, I don't know about you, I remember myself, I was in Near Israel at the time, so I didn't know anything that was going on. Some of you may have been in synagogues and maybe heard during the day and all that, but I mean, it was a shock, a bang over the head, was it not? So I'm talking about the Yom Kippur War. I'll tell you again, I came home from yeshiva and I didn't know anything, and then boom, So it was Hubris and Atonement, State of Israel and the Jewish people, 1972-75. Tonight is the first lecture called Quiet Before the Storm, the Golda Era, or the Golden Era if you prefer, in its heyday. And here we go. Obviously, I'm talking, and those of you here last year, I'm just picking up where I left off. At the time we're talking about, Golda Meir was the Prime Minister of Israel this entire period. For a fairly long time, 5 years. She would have gone longer if not for the war and all that. So that's kind of interesting. And as you saw, she was an unusual person. She was as old as the century. If you ever want to figure out Golda Meir, it's 1898, so she's +2. So when she became Prime Minister, she was, 71? And when she left, she was, actually, she was into 74. So, 76 and so forth, that's what you're talking about. Doesn't seem so old anymore, right? And she was, if you have any memory, and for those of you who are not old to remember, she was the public face, right? She was the embodiment of the system, right? And the whole world knew this. So Golda Meir was remarkable in this particular regard. But there was nobody in the world that didn't know this face. And as I said, she was the public face of the system, with a capital T and an S. What was the system? The system was the ruled by Mapai party since 1933. I want to call your attention to the fact that the labor movement, this left wing, the socialists and all that, which were in different party formations over the period, it's like cell division, they came and they regrouped. But Ben-Gurion and company took over the majority of the Zionist movement in 1933. That's just important to know. So that means that, Ben-Gurion was in power for 30 years, from 1933 to 1963. He didn't start on May 14th, 1948. He was the Jewish leader beforehand. Controversial and all, but the bottom line is he was head of what they called the Sochnut, the Jewish agency, which became the Israeli government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a certain group of people, a clique, if you wish, that ruled uninterruptedly for about 40 years. That's kind of interesting. It's the same face of Ben-Gurion and Golda and Sharet and Sapir and this, that, and the other. There's always a plus and a minus to that, but the plus is the stability, correct? And you're not changing the face all the time. The minus is the stability. No, nothing ever changes. There are some organizations, synagogues, and things that are like that. Not in Baltimore, but elsewhere. And that's how it goes. So Ben-Gurion, when he was in charge, tried to make things as purely Mapai as possible, and he did, meaning power was concentrated during his years in a very small number of hands. Foreign policy and defense particularly were in his hands. Now, he wasn't a dictator exactly, but he got his way most of the time. The economics of it, I'm not going to bore you with the details, were in the hands of one or two people all the time, and so forth. Now, this is interesting. That was the system. When you move to Israel, I know we have some people here from the old days, you move to Israel, you want to get a job, you want to get ahead, we've discussed this in the past. You got to go with the system or have a rich uncle in Chutz La'aretz. That's how it goes. So this is kind of interesting. When Ben-Gurion left office in '63, so Eshkol broadened the base a little bit by saying, well, it's not going to be Mapai, but also be, Mapam and Achdut Avodah and the other groups. So it's the socialist movement in a wider way, but it's still the same, what they call the Marach, the alignment. So I want you to understand, in Ben-Gurion's time, in the 50s, for example, these other guys were out. Mapam and these other fellows, they could not have access to the important offices. Prime Minister, Defense Minister, Foreign Minister, Treasury Minister, Chinuch, Education Minister, always in the hands of Mapai, for example. It's interesting, isn't it, right? And things like agriculture, always in the hands of Mapai. The other coalition partners used to get, smaller sorts of things. The Mizrahi always got the post office, and the Mizrahi always got the interior minister, which sounds impressive, but in Israel they divorced the police from the interior minister, so basically you're in charge of the file cards, which is important also if you're religious, because they want Mehu Yehudi, But I'm just saying that's the way the system worked. When Eshkol came in, he said, we can have people outside the Mapai, and they can be part of it also. By the time Golda Meir takes over, because Eshkol died in early '69, sick man, by the time Golda comes in, she leads this Ma'arach, as they called it, which is the alignment, meaning all these left Zionist parties. There's not the communists, right? This is the Zionist parties. To victory in the 1969 election, so she had a stable government. It's actually amazing when you consider Israel today. How many people were in Golda Meir's coalition? About 100. That's unbelievable. No, there's no opposition. The Marach had like in the 50s, and Begin was in, that's 20-something, and the Mizrahi was in, so that's 12. By the time you finish, you're talking about some really big numbers. So that's a good thing, sort of, and that Israel had, quote unquote, a stable situation in which, like, the government's not going to fall tomorrow over some issue and all that. So it's very different than Israel today, isn't it? Today, the government's much smaller majorities, and their hold on power is tenuous. Bibi Netanyahu has been around for a long time, but he's always dancing, correct? He's always got to be maneuvering, the artful dodger, as they say. You got to do that. It wasn't like that in Golda Meir's time. She sat at the top of a fortress, of an iceberg, if you prefer, but a very powerful group. Now, so the system that will go into the Yom Kippur War will be one with a very strong electoral and political base. It's not like she had a 1 or 2 person majority, and when the war hit, they said, "Oh, let's overthrow her government and put in a new government," or something like that. Well, that wasn't in the cards. And Golda Meir was a charismatic world figure. She had, where are you going to find anybody? Let's go back one. Where are you going to find out somebody? Sometimes like that. But it was true, wasn't it? I think it was known at that time. She actually baked, without being funny, and she baked cookies for the cabinet, which met in her living room, and all this kind of stuff. And yet, at the other hand, although she looks a little out of place there, but people like that. So she had, as they say, this. She had a charisma, and most importantly for our purposes, Golda Meir embodies the Israeli consensus not to decide about the occupied territories. Went at that great length last year. So I don't know, most of you were here. That's what happened after the '67 war. They couldn't decide, so they decided not to decide. Nobody ever said it, but that's what happens. Do you want peace? Everybody wants peace. What do you want to give up? I want peace. Yeah, but what parts do you want to give up? I want peace. Right? Or if you prefer Abba Eben's famous line, I want defensible borders. What are defensible borders? Borders that can be defended, Where's the line? Do you want to give up the Sinai Desert and all the? I want borders that can be defended. That was the language over there. So, and incidentally, was it right? Was it wrong? It's what happened, and it's psychologically understandable. Give it up, because let's face it, there was nobody in the Arab world at that time saying like this: "Let's have peace and love." That was in San Francisco. They didn't have it in the Middle East. Remember, Humphrey said, it's not the Midwest, it's the Mideast. It's a difference. So once you're doing like that, why should I give up anything? What do I gain? Why should I give up anything? in addition to issues about Eretz Yisrael, Lehmann, and all that. So she was the public face of that, because Golda Meir was not in Begin's party. She was in the Mapai. The Mapai historically had been in favor of cutting deals when possible, but Lamais, after the 48 war, in the international environment which we spent these last couple of years going over, there was no Arab country that really wanted peace. There isn't one today. It's all temporary. I get a peace until the chance I get to destroy you. So when I know that, it's a different dynamic. Anyhow, so she was this person. This looks pretty. That's how people thought. You kind of like it. That was the mentality. You understand it. And so Israel does have the military might to hold on to the territories. And at that time, people said like this: we don't have to patchk with it. Moshe Dayan is in charge. He was the Minister of Defense. And the idea was that he knows what he's doing better than anybody else. I think I skipped one. Let's go back for a second. We'll go back, yeah. She had what they call the dream team, which means if you asked anybody at that time, who is more uniquely qualified to be in charge of national security, and Moshe Dayan, naturally. Who is the best diplomat? What's to talk about, And in those days, they saw Pinchas Apir, who was the one creating fact that he knew what he's doing. So it was like the public thought that the people who are in charge know what they're doing. You understand? That's the point I'm trying to make. And so Moshe Dayan was not only in charge of the army, and after all, we just won the 6-Day War, so he proved we had the best army they ever seen in the world, blah, blah, blah. But he knows how to handle the Arabs. He speaks a little bit of Arabic, not much. And people thought, oh, he understands them, and he can handle it, and so on and so forth. And that took the burden off of anybody having to decide what to do with the territories. With Yehuda, Shomron, and Gaza, and all the rest of it. I mean, that's what you have to remember from that era. And since he was in total charge, so for better or worse, if you're the average Israeli, I don't know, leave it to Dayan, like that. Let's take a look at this little...
From the very beginning of the occupation in 1967, terror attacks by the Palestinians threatened to break the illusion that all was well. But Dayan was always there to diffuse public anger.
המטרה של דיין לא הייתה האוכלוסייה הערבית. המטרה של דיין הייתה האוכלוסייה בישראל. ולאחר כל פיגוע, היינו הולכים לטייל באזור שהיה הפיגוע. אני זוכר כמה ביקורים כאלה בעיר העתיקה בירושלים, מאחוריו שובל של עיתונאים וצלמי טלוויזיה, שמצלמים בדיין נכנס לחנות, שותה קפה עם החלבני, קונה אצלו עתיקות, ומפגין את אותה ההבחנה והברורה. אין לנו, אסור לנו לראות בכלל האוכלוסייה האויב, להפך.
Dayan wanted the occupation to be as invisible as possible. But the moment any Palestinian resisted occupation, he took strict measures.
وأيضا كانوا في ظهر حركة فدائية، حركة للمقاومة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي. كانوا الحقيقة يقومون باعتقالهم وتعذيبهم. كنت أحد أول رئيس بلدية زار السجون وطلع على عملية تعذيب.
האומנות בשיטת ניהול השטחים של דיין הייתה אומנות של אדם שיושב ליד שני ברזים, ברז של מים רותחים, ברז של מים צוננים, והוא כל הזמן מבסט את הברזים לפי הצורך הדרוש, קצת יותר חם, קצת יותר קר, וזה עובד יוצא מן הכלל. התנאי לניהול מדיניות כזו הוא שאתה, משה דיין, א', מבין שצריך תמיד מה מידת הטמפרטורה הרצויה, אם קצת יותר חמה או קצת יותר קרה, וב' יושב כל הזמן על הברזים.
Deportations, curfews, and the destruction of houses became the ugly bedrock of the occupation. Heyday Abdashafin was deported twice from Gaza to the Israeli-controlled Sinai Desert.
أنا شخصياً فوجئت بالقرار بإتباعي مع آخرين ولم أكن أعرف عن أي سبب. قلنا إحنا طبعاً في
If you were a young Palestinian gentleman, do you not think that you might become a guerrilla factor?
I don't know. Depends what I would have thought. Had I thought that I stand a chance to having a Palestinian state here with the Israelis, I would probably do it. But had I thought that it's a pointless and purposeless battle, then I would settle in one of the neighboring countries. I don't think that it's really forward for any Palestinian to see in Jordan or in Iraq or in Syria his pendant.
Now today, the reality sounds so different. It doesn't sound very dated, you know. It's the British BBC, so they don't like Israel, the rest of it. But at that time, you could get away with that, and there was, Israel could do it. And if you're the public, it's like buying chicken and meat in the market. As long as I don't see, you know, I just see the final package over there. So that's the plain, honest reality of what was going on in Israel at that time. So they're holding on the shtachim, as they call the rest. They had a big population, and the army, Dayan, was constantly, you know, maneuvering this way and that way, and everybody was happy. At least the Jews were. The PLO is not an army, not in those years. It's a small terrorist business. They were had some numbers of soldiers, and I mean, they're not taking on the Israeli army. No, it wasn't even close to it. So Arafat was just a figure if you're talking in purely military terms. The big neighbor was Jordan, and Jordan was very weak. This is particularly the period I'm talking about in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. If you recall last year, they had a giant civil war in 1970 where A killed B and then B killed A and all the rest of it. And King Hussein won in the end, but it was a very close call. He wasn't a threat to Israel, not militarily. As a matter of fact, he was actually depending on Israel to help him stay on the throne, which is the best scenario for Israel. Agree? The Hashemite government you have there till today is the best deal you're going to get, like it or not, because anything else is going to be much worse. And Israel's well aware of this. You understand? So that was the reality at that time. On the other side, you had Egypt. That's a different story. Egypt's a much bigger country. And Egypt was going crazy that their territory had been occupied. The Sinai Desert was considered a big patch in their face. This was the big disgrace of Nasser. He lost a lot of land. And in the wake of the 1967 war, Nasser was determined, we talked about this last year, to rebuild the Egyptian army and have it out again in some fashion or another. And so Russia jumped in with both feet. And the Egyptian army during the period I'm talking about in the early 70s is in a large process of transformation and a buildup. It just was. And Israel knew all this, and they're on top of all the information, and they got surprise attacked anyway. The Egyptian army in this area is one of the largest in the world, 750,000. That's a gigantic army. It costs a lot of money. They didn't even have the money at that time. So everything was artificial. They would get pumped money from Saudi Arabia and those kind of places to keep the army going to pay the bills and pay the Russians for the weapons that they were giving them, which they gave them a ton of weapons. Little countries or economically not, I mean, any country in the world cannot sustain a very large army for a long time. I don't know if you know that or not. Actually, that eventually it broke the back of the Soviet Union, did it not? That's what did it. Their military was just too big and didn't have the economic, even America wouldn't have the economic thing to have millions of men in the army all at one time. We did it for a little bit up to the Vietnam War, but we can't afford that. So how could Egypt? But they were so determined in that era that somehow they got the money together and they built up a gigantic army by the standards of that time, so it's potentially a threat to Israel, obviously. But the declining health of Nasser, who dies in 70, and the shaky beginnings of Sadat, his successor, Anwar Sadat, plus the poor performance of the Egyptian soldiers in the Six-Day War, led Israel to feel that the Egyptian army was not prepared to actually attack Israel. This is the hubris. The Israelis had persuaded themselves that the Egyptians are not good soldiers. There were grounds for these feelings. Israel, as we saw last year, did hurt Egypt in the war of attrition. remember they kept raiding them and blowing up the radar stations and running over people and all that sort of thing. I mean, no question they gave them a heavy black eye. I might recall to you from last year that Egypt hurt Israel. Okay, so when they finally had that ceasefire, both sides were happy in 1970. I don't know if you recall that, what I'm talking about, but we went into some detail. It used to be called the War of Hatashah, of attrition, and Israel can't afford a war of attrition. So they hurt us, but we hurt them. We hurt them bad. Cairo, Alexandria, full of sandbags, and those, I mean, if you remember that, like London and the Blitz, because every once in a while during the War of Attrition, the Israeli Air Force would bomb, especially the outskirts of Cairo and places like that, which is a big humiliation for the Egyptian government, the regime. I remember that the artifacts in the Antiquities Museum, you know, the mummies and all that had to be put in storage place because it might be bombed. All of which means that the Egyptians were living in an emergency situation, so that wasn't great for them. And that made Israel feel, you know, if they mess with us, we can really bust them. The ceasefire that eventually took place just before the death of Nasser was seen in Israel as desperately desired by both sides. And there is truth to that. But Israel forgot that Israel was also desperate for it. So a lot of these things have to do with a feeling of being cocky. Although Sadat, when he took over, constantly talked about renewing the war, he didn't. So he said, we're going to recover our land this year, and he didn't do anything. And then in 71, this is the year. And 72, he said, this is the year of decision, and all that kind of stuff. So all that meant was that Israelis came to believe that he wouldn't because he couldn't. So they looked at him like a joke. I don't know if you recall this, but it's a little while ago, but I remember that. You know, he wasn't taken as a serious figure. And it's a very good military argument that the border of the Suez Canal, that it can't get better than that. Because, you know, every military in the world wants a water barrier in between the other side, because then you know we're here and you're on that side. In World War II, when the Russians and the Americans finally met up, you know, Eisenhower said, don't cross the Elbe River, I want a river there. This is the Russian side, this is the American side. You know, we love that, the Rio Grande. It gets dicey when it's land borders, you know, and then it's tricky, like you stepped over my feet, I stepped over your feet. Water is the way to go. Well, the Suez Canal. I don't know if everybody realizes the Suez Canal was out of condition, didn't work, from 67 to 74. Okay? Now, mind you, it so happens that that was a plus for the USA. And by that I mean the following, that it was the Vietnam War, and Russia was the main one supplying the North Vietnamese. And for the Russian ships, the best route for them to sail is out of the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, down through the Suez Canal, and around that way. I don't know why it didn't work for them to do it from Vladivostok, but apparently it didn't. So when Israel happened to block the Suez Canal, not that that was the plan, it actually was a plus for America in the Vietnam War, which is why the U.S. never said, oh, you're interrupting international traffic, and so on and so forth. It's kind of funny that way. But the Europeans and the others didn't like it, of course. And Moshe Dayan famously said, we got the best tank barrier in the world, which one would think was true. Now, the Suez Canal is not that big. It's, if I'm not mistaken, I think from here to there is how wide the water is. That's all. You know, if I'm wrong, not by much. It's not wide at all. And if you look, you can look at the pictures. You can see the other side. It's not so wide. So it is what it is. And it was kind of deep, but nevertheless, is a tank barrier, as the expression goes. And by the way, it wasn't only Moshe Dayan that felt this way. Here's a video of Ariel Sharon, who's running for office in '73. He thought, with the new party Likud, saying, as long as we stay in the Suez Canal, it's ein sikuyim. There's no possibility for the enemy to attack us.
אנחנו עומדים על עמדות ערב סואץ. כל עוד אנחנו עומדים על עמדות התעלה, אין למצרים כל סיכוי לנצח במלחמה או להשיג הישג כלשהו במלחמה כוללת או במלחמה חלקית.
Okay, so I mean, if Sharon is saying it, you know, then that really was a widespread business. It's even funny, he's the one who later crossed the canal the other way, didn't he? So that takes care of PLO, Jordan, Egypt, Syria. That's already no water barrier. Israel had, as you know, the Golan Heights. Here's the Golan Heights. So here's the Kinneret, I guess, and here's the Israeli border, the old border, right? 48 border, and look how much extra they took. All this. So if you're Israel, you say, this is great, it's a real buffer, and it was. But on the other hand, it's a piece of Syria. And what's Syria going to do about it? Syria is brutal. I think we all know that. But at the time when Golda Meir, they're not strong enough to take on Israel on their own. They had one government after another government until this guy took over, and then he was there until he died for 30 years. But he did it in the Stalin way. He'd just kill everybody. And he was good at it. His son has tried to do it. Never, he's just not that good at mass killing. You know, he tried. You can't blame him. And that's why they have the civil war. I mean, he gave it his best shot, you know. But if the world wasn't looking, he could get away with the poison gas. You know, who are we talking about? Just understand, who are you talking about? And when Assad takes over, I mean, obviously he wants to get back to Golan Heights because, as we know today, with our much greater sophistication of Syrian internal politics due to the reporting of the last 10 years or so with the civil war, it turns out he's an Alawite, right? And he's not a Muslim, and the Muslims hate him, and the whole country's at each other's throats, I'm happy to say. And if he can get back to Golan Heights, he'll really get legitimacy, will he not? So he's there, but he's not strong enough. As you know, in the Yom Kippur War, he's going to have to ally with Egypt. And even then, he will not be successful in the end. So Israel has bad neighbors, but they're not strong enough. And finally, you have this interesting or distressing border with Lebanon, which is over here, right? Which has turned into a cancer, as we all know today. Lebanon is the big tragedy, as I would say it, of the 6-Day War, because up to the 6-Day War, it was quiet. If you in Israel, you lived up here in these places, Naria, you never had any trouble from Lebanon. I'm talking about from 48 to 67, 49, 67. If anybody ever stepped to the border of Lebanon, the Lebanese stopped you. It's just interesting. They said, we don't need trouble with Israel. We have enough trouble holding on to this country to prevent it from blowing up. After the 6-Day War, tensions began to increase in general in the Middle East, the Arab world particularly, I'll talk about next week. And Lebanon's a big carbon because the fragile coexistence between the different groups, the Sunni, the Shia, the this one, that, and the other one, Christians all began to unravel. And that wasn't good for Israel, because the best scenario for Israel was a stable, quiet country in Lebanon. And particularly after 1970, when the PLO was kicked out of Jordan in that bloody civil war, they ran away to Lebanon. Jordan at least had an army that could crush them. Lebanon did not. So that means you had guys moving, bad hombres, move to Lebanon. No. And nobody could stop them. That's bad for Israel. Because what do you think the first thing they do is? They set up things and start sending raids into Israel. And the Golda Meir period, we forget this, saw a whole bunch of little battles, mini wars in the Lebanon border that have not stopped more or less till, I mean, it stopped now because of terror. You know, in other words, they got 1 million rockets on their side and the Hezbollah and all the rest, but it didn't stop for decades. So these are called Yom Krav, a day of war. It's not a whole war, it's a day of war. And Israel would invade with a column or Air Force and stuff like that and blow this up. It kind of reminds you of what the Talmud tells us, and we know from history, was a permanent situation of the Roman Empire versus the Germans on the Rhine River. That the Romans always have to send across an army and raid and this, that, and the other, keep them off their feet. But you know very well that a year later or less, you have to do it all over again. In Poland, what the Cossacks used to call it mowing the lawn or cutting the fingernails, they use all these kinds of metaphors for the fact that it's a problem, it's not going to go away. And Israel starts to have trouble with this and will continue to have trouble with this low level in Golda's time. And her government didn't come up with any solution, because what could you do? The only way you could do it is to have a strong Lebanese government that would kick the PLO out. That's not going to happen. And so that turns out to be a very interesting border. It's a sword that doesn't go away. But having said that, if you lived at the time I'm talking about, in 1972, 73, and so forth, it did not look like Israel was going to get involved in a conventional war. They're not strong enough. This facilitated the unspoken attitude of let's hold on to everything. And what about all the Palestinians and the Arabs living in all these other places? Mañana, tomorrow we'll figure it out. The old line, maybe the king will die, the dog will die, or something like that. Meaning they had no answer. You understand? They had no answer. And it's, as we know, the problem's still there today. So Israelis themselves were still supercharged over the Six-Day War victory, and they read more into it than it deserved. This is always a problem in history in many countries, which is, we talk about fake news and all that. There's such a thing called fake memory. When a country imagines or remembers a war different than it actually was. Last year, was it, or whenever? Talked about this with the Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked the US, they were nuts. Because they worked themselves in a fake memory of the Russian-Japanese war, like they walked all over Russia. That's actually not what had happened, but by the time they finished interpreting it, that's what happened. In the 67 war, Israel, of course, won, and we talked about this in great detail last year, but the Arabs had to make a lot of mistakes for that to happen. And most importantly, I don't know if you recall this, most importantly, when Israel went into the Sinai at the beginning of the Six-Day War, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army panicked, Abdul Akam Amir, and he ordered immediate withdrawal and retreat, which freaked out all the Egyptian soldiers. They were running away as the Israelis were attacking and running towards the Suez Canal. So the fish stinks from the top, as they say in the Middle East. And he messed it up. If he would have said, stand and die where you are, all the rest of it, Israel would have had a lot bigger casualties and a tougher time, much tougher time, in winning the Six-Day War. But since it turned into relatively a cakewalk, and said he lost 600-700 men, not that I'm making light of that, so they worked themselves into a memory. Oh, we walked all over the Arabs, Srichin Lakish at the, Lakota Bushim al Rosh, Pam Bashnatayim and all that, and that's how they used to talk, And it's okay as long as you don't believe it, but if you believe it, then it becomes a self-defeating kind of image. The Arabs are not bad soldiers, really, especially in certain situations, defensive and others, and they're not morons. Israel is better, but they're pretty good. And it's much wiser to have a healthy respect for the adversary and plan accordingly than to do that the Israelis, we can take them on. You'll see when we get to it that, in the Golan front, before the Yom Kippur War, the guy says, how many tanks we have there? About 100. What did the enemy have? About 1,000. That's okay. 100 Israeli tanks to take out 1,000. It kind of reminds you, remember in Gone with the Wind at the beginning, they say, one Confederate can take 100 Yankees. It just wasn't true. They learned it. It's stupid to talk that way. You see? I mean, you want to have a conversation at a drinking party, it's okay with me. But, if you actually make decisions based on that, right? Isn't that what happened to the South? They thought we can walk all over the Yankees and all the rest of it. Turns out they couldn't. Turns out they couldn't. You can't talk yourself into these kinds of things. Many countries get into wars that way. It's a fascinating topic. I could go many examples. Many countries, they talk themselves, it'll be a cakewalk. What price glory, It'll all be easy. And then it isn't, you see? So the Israelis were drunk with victory. Sure, I could show you, I just didn't feel like it. Shimon Peres has a whole interview. He said we were shikur, we were drunk with victory. I remember in the early 70s that, Peres and Sharon used to write books and say Israel's a superpower. Do you remember such a language? Israel's a superpower. They got as Disraeli put it, they were inebriated with the exuberance of their own verbosity. You understand? And, Shimon Peres like this. If you count how many kilowatts of electricity between the Mediterranean and China, Israel has like 50% or something like that. All right, though, So it's like, what are we, the U.S.? Are you crazy? It's a little Israel. And Sharon said also, he says, our tank force is superior to this, that, and the other all over the place. I get it, and I'm glad Israel has a qualitative edge, and they did, but are you crazy? You don't think in these terms. But that's the hubris, we paid the price. So that's what it is. Do you remember this book? Anybody? Yeah, I remember it from around 1970 or so. Oh, how Israel built up the most impressive military industry in the world. It ain't the most impressive military in the world. It's good, right? You can't compare with America, with France, with England. Yeah, don't fool yourself, right? And by the way, when the war hits and they see the Egyptians and Syrians with thousands and thousands of bombs and tanks and thousands of RPGs, all the rest of it, they say, whoa. It's like, where you been? So it's a problem. It was a problem. Furthermore, Israel was desperately fragile. It still is. For the simplest of reasons, there's no money. Right? Everybody knows armies cost a fortune. Here's my favorite general, Montecuccoli, that was a very famous household name, I know. And what did he say? War depends on three things: ala kesef, ala gelt, ala gelt. That's a famous line. He in his Ars Militarium, which he wrote in the 17th century. It's a very fantastic book. And and he commanded 100 campaigns. And he said, war depends on three things: gelt, gelt, and gelt. Well, guess what Israel does not have a lot of in 1970 or today? Okay, gelt, gelt, and gelt. So what are you talking? And let me tell you something. This will be a giant Achilles heel, because when it comes close to the Yom Kippur War, and it says, should we mobilize the army? Golda Meir says, well, it's going to cost $50 million. Yeah, that doesn't count me growing trees, maybe not, all the rest of it. So you actually don't have the wherewithal to play the game. So what are you doing in Monte Carlo? You understand? It's a problem. So it's a problem. Israel is a funny superpower. It had a strong torso and weak legs. It had a strong military and a weak economy. And even the torso is not so pushant. Because Israel, as we know even today, cannot, every society has its own unique, cultural features. We can't take big casualties. That's who we are as a people. It really affects us a lot. Israel will lose, I think you know this already, 4,000 men in the Yom Kippur Wars. Oh, the sky is falling. If you're Stalin, that's what they did every 15 minutes in Stalingrad, as you know, right? If you're in some of your major battles in World War, that's what happens. In Vietnam, we lost like 3,000 people more or less every month, during the hot times. Remember they used to have on the news? And things like that. But they can't handle it because, to be perfectly honest, the United States of America does not do well with big casualties either, if you know their history. During World War II, when we had bad losses, Roosevelt hid it and he wouldn't tell anybody. You understand? There was one time they showed a movie about Tarawa, when the Marines landed and lost 1,000 men and the whole country freaked out. You see? So it's a feature perhaps of a democratic society, I don't know. But Israel can't handle this. In the last war too in Gaza, they were going crazy if one soldier get kidnapped. I appreciate that, and you do too, and we all know the Jews have a tremendous respect for the life of every Yid, and we all, I don't have to tell this audience what it's all about, but you really can't go into a war with like that. You know what I'm saying? It's not realistic. So Israel has a tremendous Achilles heel. By the way, let me just check this out. How many soldiers were killed in Gettysburg? I heard 20,000? 50 or 60,000? No, the whole business, in the battlefield, the whole business. How many were killed in Gettysburg? 3,100 Union, 3,900 Confederate. Had a lot of wounded. I'm just trying to, I always get this, people think it's not true. They didn't lose a zillion people in a battle in Civil War. It's just not true. You see how a fake memory works? It's interesting. 3155 Union, Confederate 3903. Right? So when you have, and that was considered unbelievably bloody and all the rest of it, which it was. But now you consider Israel lost 3,500, whatever, in the Yom Kippur War. I'll push it. So is that a military superpower when you can't handle big blows, it doesn't always consist of you hitting the other guy. Once in a while, they hit you. You see? So it is what it is. And economically, I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli economy in the Golda years. The crazy Israeli economy, what I like to call Zionist economics. By the early 70s, Israel economy was always a weird situation, particularly weird situation. Israel started back under Ben Gurion with people making bupkis. The only way wage earners could live was through socialized, subsidized food, rent control, and other socialist shtick. So in other words, the government makes it, this is the only way it could manage. If the government makes it that bread costs a penny and milk costs a penny, which it did once upon a time, okay? And the half cheese and all that stuff was 2 cents and so forth. If it's like that, so you can make it. Because people only make like $1, a week or a day or something. They get very little, very, very little money. On the other hand, in the Ben Gurion years, a certain economy was built up, especially the infrastructure. That did happen between 48 and 63, under these socialist technocrats with economics degrees. We've talked about that. The tiny, real earning power doubled in the Ben Gurion years. So from making $1 a day, he made $2 a day. The results were tiny, but better. I mean, it's impressive in its way. The trouble was the other side of the ledger. Defense costs a fortune, which Israel didn't have. And socialism has its minuses besides the pluses. And between 55 and 66, the per capita consumption rose by 221%, more than double the rate of wages. So I think, without boring people, yeah, you make more now, but everything costs a lot more. Okay? Your salary went up 100%, but everything else went up 200%, more than 200%. So it's bad. To pay, the Ben Gurion governments borrowed and borrowed and imported and imported. They didn't want to, but that's what they did. I think we all know where that leads. Okay? So, I've heard of countries that borrow too much. As I tried to explain in the last 2 years, Levi Eshkol tried to fix the unhealthy aspects of the economy through belt tightening, but it didn't work. This was Israel's last chance to achieve a kind of a balanced budget and stop increasing the national debt somewhere along the lines of a Milton Friedman. That's Ira's brother. Now, the Six-Day War broke the bank once and for all. After that, Israel became dependent on borrowing and could not stop itself. That's why they didn't even try. There was no attempt in the wake of the Six-Day War, with all the huge expense of running the territories, all the rest of it, and Israel couldn't stop itself any more than the USA. This country has never been able to stop the borrowing, the increase of the debt. I'd like to see the president do that. The Golda Meir economy was unusual. As with the Ben Gurion economy, there were constructive aspects and non-constructive aspects. On the positive side, the technocrats continued to slowly but steadily increase productivity, which is very important. They did do that. The Mapai plan had always been to constantly and so increase the productivity as to attain a balanced budget that way. This was always the dream of Sapir and these other people. If you don't understand what I just said, ask Guy over there and he'll explain it. Now, you want at the point to be able that you're producing enough that you won't have to, okay. Now, this was a nice idea, but it did not turn out to be realistic. A slowly, steadily increasing productivity could not provide enough money to cover the structural problems of the country's economic situation. It ain't enough. First of all, you had these high military costs. Israel is not Ireland, and it's not Denmark. These costs rose after the Six-Day War because Israel has to maintain an empire and keep, at least at a basic level, up with the rapidly expanding Arab armies. If Nasser is rebuilding like crazy, which he was, and he's getting new planes and the planes he's replacing them is sort of newest Soviet stuff. So he was getting new planes, and he was constantly doing that. 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. It didn't stop. And the newest tanks, and more of them, and more of them, and more of them, and the missiles, the SAM-1, the SAM-3, by the time you get to the Yom Kippur, where it's the SAM-6, which Israel had no answer to. This is one of the reasons they lost the Yom Kippur War to the part that they lost. They had no answer for that advance. The Russians, unfortunately, the Soviet Union couldn't do anything right except what? Your military. Okay, that they got right. So as this country knows. So Israel, so Israel has to, if you're in charge of the Israeli military budget, if you're Dayan, you got to keep buying and upgrading new stuff. That's not something that is discretionary, shall we say. And so this was terrible. And especially the American weapons, when they got them, and they were lucky to get them because America didn't give it out to Israel the way Russia did. I told you about that last year. Neither LBJ nor Nixon. When they finally got their Phantoms, etc., it cost a lot of money. Israel was fortunate that the USA lent them the money to purchase the planes. You hear that? The Congress lent them the money to buy the planes, but they lent them, they didn't give them. So that added to the debt. Hundreds of millions. I mean, the Phantom, the Patton tank, is not cheap. Now, Baruch Hashem, America did that. You understand? Because otherwise Israel would go under. I mean, do you realize the significance of what I just said? If in 68 and 69 and 70, 71 and all the rest of it, they didn't lend them the money to buy the stuff, Israel would be doomed because the other side's getting more and more and Israel's not. And Israel didn't get anywhere near the quantity that the Arabs were getting, but they said, but we need a basic amount. And I think you remember last year, and I'm going to talk about this year, they're constantly begging Nixon for the Phantoms, the way they were begging Johnson for the Skyhawks, and you're dribbling him out, although in the election year it'll give it to him. Okay, but that's cost a lot of money, a lot of money. So all of a sudden, the superpower is not so push-it, is it? Okay? Secondly, an expanding consumerism hit Israel right after the 6-Day War. Israel had been a pretty, what's the right word, puritanical in terms of spending for the most part on part of people back in the 50s and 60s. After the 6-Day War, with that release of tension, some people said, I want to be like everybody else. Tourism exploded. Raise your hand if you went to Israel after the 6-Day War. There you go. So he says, and I'll ask a better question, a much better question. Who went to Israel prior to the 6-Day War? A few, not many. See, very few. After and prior. And no, it's because the 6-Day War triggered a huge tourism. Wait a minute. And foreign visitors with cash were all over the place. This is highly inflationary and also stimulates the local Israelis. Says, I want to have one of those too. He's got a transistor radio. Remember those things? Woo! And I want to have one, and they can afford the cars. No, I'm serious. And anyway, in general, the 60s was the age of global consumerism. Maybe people don't remember it that way. If you remember the 60s, which, as I look around the crowd, some of you probably don't remember the 60s, but it's not because you weren't there. But 60 was the age of global consumerism, because that's when the world recovered from World War II, and Europe started to make money. And now it hit Israel with both barrels. I think this picture says it all. This is the old Israel. Here's the new. No. People want to live. The girl don't want that anymore. So, without being funny. I think it speaks 1,000 words. They say, we want to be like a European country, like America, and all the rest of it. And ever since the 6-Day War, Israel has, jumped with both feet as much as it can into consumerism. That is what killed the kibbutzim and the socialism and all the rest of it. Wasn't Begin's, ideology or something like that. The children themselves in the kibbutzim, say, this. I want to move to Herzliya and live like that. You understand? So it's not capitalism so much that triumphed in the late 20th century. It's consumerism. The reason that the young rejected communism was not because they were opposed to the doctrines of Karl Marx, because they couldn't get that. And they saw, again, who here was in Soviet Russia, and who here was approached by 100 people to sell the jeans? Anybody remember that? I do. A pair of shoes, things like that. What does that tell you? The consumerism killed the communism, not the weapons. So, question is, will consumerism kill Israel? Well, kill the pocketbook. Because they're a poor country, they can't afford it. Since consumer goods had to be imported for the most part, it really hurt the balance of payments. And neither Golda Meir nor Pinchas Sapir were inclined to really turn on the austerity screws and alienate voters. because that will really count. So they couldn't say, so Israel had this business, and I think many of us remember, you couldn't import this, you couldn't import that, but people did. I don't know how they did, but they got it. How'd this person get a TV from Germany, and how'd this one get a thing, a transistor from Japan, how'd this one get a thing from America, but they got it, you understand? It's not healthy. Instead, what Golda and her government did was they followed a policy in which they opposed imports, but imports happened anyway. As we recall, it's not possible that you don't remember this, the public face of this economic non-transparency was the black market dollar exchange rate. Raise your hands if you actually went to the bank to exchange your dollars, went to Israel. I will say how many liars are here. Okay, there's not even one. Not even one, right? What does that tell you, right? What is that? Yeah, there's one person who said, my wife told me to go. She said, what? That's an iconic representation that we all know, we experienced. Iconic representation of the Zionist economics, as it were, in which the official rates, which are based on official policies of non-importation and belt tightening and all this kind of stuff, and a kind of autarky and mercantilism, as they used to call it when I was a kid, and so forth, weren't real. You see? That's not what people did, okay? They did other things. That's a very unhealthy economic situation. Israel tried to help its economy, and did help its economy, through a kind of economic colonialism vis-a-vis the occupied territories. This was a big plus for Israel. It wasn't enough, but it was a big plus. The Arabs in the occupied territories, especially in those years, constituted a gigantic cheap labor force. Now we all say, oh, that's terrible, as they drive to Home Depot and pick up Hispanic workers every morning, okay? How many people have maids, whatever. There's never been an economy I know of. I'm going to say something quite profound, or at least it seems profound. Maybe deep down it's superficial, but it seems profound. He says, I've never heard of an economy that did well in any way or shape without cheap labor. And when you can't get cheap labor the normal way, they get cheap labor the other way. So in this country, the labor unions waged a successful fight in the 20th century not to be cheap labor, so they're put aside and they get illegal labor. That's what it is. So Israel, like America, like everybody else, had all these Muslims come to Europe that they're taking over now. Where'd they come from? They want cheap labor. It's not good, it's what it is. The Arabs did the same thing. If you remember, Saddam Hussein had this gigantic Thailand workforce, building his airfields and things like that. Koreans. It's a cheap labor. So Israel, after 67, this was one of Dayan's turning on the faucet, like the guy said. And he said, I guess you're going to have all these Arabs not going to have a job. Let them get a job working in construction or janitor anywhere in Israel. He said, there'll be terrorists. There'll be a relatively small number, which was true in those years. And by and large, it'll work. And it did. And you know how it always is with the employer of cheap labor. Yeah, he's getting $1 a day, but it's twice as much as he was making in Guatemala. So they said same thing. Yeah, we're paying him bupkis, but he was making half a bupkis when he lived in Nablus. And it's true. It's not incorrect. But on the other hand, it's economically not a great, right? Or from the democratic, healthy, normal economy, it's not great. Or maybe I'm wrong, because I just told you can't have one of these economies without cheap labor. It's a conundrum, isn't it? And second of all, so by the way, Israel has a construction boom after 67, very much influenced by the fact you have a large body of cheap labor. In addition to that, in the best colonialist sense, you now have an exclusive market for Israeli products. Remember England ruled India once, and therefore you could only buy something from England? Have you ever heard of a country called America? What's the reason we had a revolution, the ostensible reason we had a revolution? Because once upon a time, before 1776, if I wanted to buy a hat, I had to buy it from London. I caught the fur over here, I sent it overseas, they made it into a hat, they send it back, and then I could wear it. I wasn't allowed to make a hat out of my own fur in this country, not in a commercial way. Okay? That's called colonialism. So if you're Israel, this is true until today, to a fair amount. If you have an orange juice company, then all the Arab stores in Nablus and Tulkarem and all that are using Israeli orange juice, toilet paper, diapers, food. You understand what I'm saying? It's a big market. Okay, the Tenuva, for example, is a big market. It wasn't enough to make up for the structural problems I just described before, but it helped. So what can I tell you? These colonialist advantages help, but they couldn't offset the ever-growing expenses of defense and consumerism. And I repeat, I didn't say it yet. In those days, the United States of America did not give Israel money. They lend them money when they, mainly for weapons. Giving money comes, after the Yom Kippur War. People don't realize it. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, early Nixon didn't give Israel money. Once in a while, in a special case, they do it, and once in a while, get 20 million here in an unusual, there's some kind of grant or whatever. But what you and I are used to, they give them billions. That started under late Nixon and kept under Ford, Carter, Reagan, and so forth. People don't realize that, okay? But it's an open fact. So in those days, Israel didn't get money from the U.S., it gave them loans. I'll say it again, Baruch Hashem for that, but still. In terms of straight contributions, there's only one place Israel can get straight contributions. Where's that? World Jewry. And even there, as you say, a lot of it was bonds, which is a loan, but it's under easy terms and all that. And in those years, I remember a lot of people, once they got the bonds, they turned it back into new bonds, because everybody wants to help Israel. But you don't get that much money from World Jewry. I mean, it's good everything you get, but wasn't enough to balance this stuff off. Agree? Wasn't enough to balance. Israel could never manage without the loans for weapons from America. You're going to get that money from World Jewry. So this is why Israel's always desperate in the Golda Meir years, in a way that you don't hear today, for cash. Here's a short video made in the War of Attrition in '69, I believe, in which Dayan will say like this: "We need American help. Give us money." World Jews.
In this helicopter today, Moshe Dayan is flying to the Suez line.
During the War of Attrition.
In our helicopter.
Here is the line along the Suez, which the Israeli army is holding in order to stop the Egyptian forces. We are an outpost on that line with Moshe Dayan.
Our main military policy here is to hold the line, to hold a static line. But it's not as simple as that. Let me put it like that. We are conducting here a static strategy, holding a stable line, but at the same time, dynamic tactics. We are striking inside Egypt, over the line, because war has its own logic. You can't just hold the line. If you really want to hold the line, you have to do things untactic. So you will see a line here, and this is our line. We are not looking after more conquerors, and we are not trying to go inside Egypt to stay there. Only we are trying to turn it into a boomerang, and to make it more difficult for the Egyptian than for us. I hope that
no, that's a fundraising sort of thing. So you go to the front line, because that's the only place you get money. It's somebody give a contribution, straight up. So to conclude, sort of, Zionist economics is what we're talking about, like that. You borrow, you help get money from America, you try to increase your productivity, you do some shtick with the Arabs, you try to get cheap labor, the whole thing together. It reminds you more than anything else of Rube Goldberg, okay, which was often used as the mashal for the Israeli economy in those days. But it's not much different today. I mean, Israel is different today, but it's not much different today. And this is a big weakness and source of fragility in there. I mean, if you have, I don't have to tell you, Obama recently, signed some gigantic aid package to Israel, and Trump is upping it. What do you need all those extra billions for? Israel needs those extra billions. They need it because that's what the weapons cost these days and things like that. So it's really tough. Now, would straightforward free market capitalism have worked in Milton Friedman style? Probably not. That would require austerity at the beginning anyway. As they say, you take the bitter medicine before the good medicine comes along. It's very hard to do in a democratic society. People freak out. And not only that, in Israel, you have the extra ugly fact, if things get bad, a lot of people leave the country. So that's a dirty secret. And so it is what it is. So the result is that probably, if they would have applied Cold War capitalism in those days, it probably would not have worked out. But I could be wrong. It might have jump-started this, right? Free market does jump-start a lot of tremendous creativity. I could write the book, the what if, like what if the South won the Gettysburg? He could write the book, what if Israel would have, I could really do fun with this. What if Israel would have gone capitalist, shall we say, free market in 1970 or 71? They would have been at the very, very, very beginning of the computers. And we have a good, brain edge on that. And Israel possibly could have led the world in this kind of business. I could see, remember those Pac-Man games and stuff like that? That's perfectly tailored for the Israeli economy. Maybe it would have taken off with that. But then again, maybe not. So we'll never know. One thing is for sure, that Golda Meir was not young, and she was of a generation who was absolutely convinced that the Histadrut and the government have to own every significant enterprise. It was old school, and they'll never see any way around it. And if you tell me it's not efficient, all the rest of it, like that, I don't want a private company owning El Al. The government should own El Al, because sometimes we need El Al to do, secret missions or whatever. So there was no startup nation under Golda. Still, in spite of everything I just said, the Israeli public at that time considered the best of times. You could go on vacation to Sharm el-Sheikh. Do you remember that? You could go on the beach. You could go all over the place. And compared to what life had been like in terms of relative austerity in the 50s and early 60s, it was, people owned a car. The car was this big, I forget what they call them. There's little cars, whatever. But myself and I was once hit by a car in Beit Lechem in the 70s, one of those cars, because it was poorly parked, and it ran into me. Didn't hurt me. I'm still here. You know what I'm saying? I'm still here. And I was skinnier too. Terrorism was manageable. This was an era in which there was some high spectacular, we did this last year, some of your spectacular hijackings and things like that. Okay, in other words, it's part of there, but it doesn't have what we call strategic implications. Another big weakness that develops in the Golda Meir period and gets worse afterwards, is Israel's international situation, which was slowly deteriorating. The Europeans were saying already at that time, why don't you negotiate land for peace? Golda Meir was a socialist, and so was Harold Wilson and Brandt, British and German. Here's Kreisky, the head of Austria. She was well known in Europe and all that sort of thing, and they're all members of the socialist fraternity. So she was better regarded in her time than, let's say, Begin or others afterwards. But still, she was always getting this business, why don't you negotiate with the Arabs? And she was a tough individual, and she gave, the Israeli line, they don't want to make peace with us, and all this kind of business. But, let's put it this way, it was a good question, and even though Golda Meir could always point to Arab intransigence, it wasn't so pashut. especially after Nasser died, even before, but after Nasser died, and Sadat was always saying, let's make a peace treaty. He didn't mean a peace treaty like he eventually made, but let's make some kind of a deal so Israel can pull out of occupied land. I mean, that just is a natural tendency for the Europeans to push for that. Because let's face it, the occupation of somebody else's country is very unusual for a long-term basis. There is no other example. And even though Israel had a good time that you started the 1967 crisis, which everybody knew was true, but after a while, it loses its, what shall I say, its emotional and rhetorical power. The biggest disaster for Israel after the 60s was France. Because France used to be a friend, and then they came into indifferent, and then they turned anti. Under Pompidou, France was what they are now, the anti. In fact, they're better now. They went through a 30-some year period in which they really were out constantly to stab Israel in the back. And why? Because why not? That way, if I was France, I get it. You get points with the Arabs. Every time you kick Israel, you get points with the Arabs. So why wouldn't you do that? So this was really bad for Israel because France is a major player in the European system. And Pompidou and the guy after him, Giscard d'Estaing, was very anti-Israel. At every chance, they issued public statements and diplomatic initiatives in the United Nations and all this kind of stuff to delegitimate Israel. And Israel couldn't stop it. Arthur Kessler, the famous writer, gave a very famous mashal, which was true, and he said, because this is the fickleness of memory, it's particularly in Europe, which is notorious for fickle memory. It's notorious. I mean, Europe is unbelievably unwise, if you know European history, unbelievably unwise. You look at all their wars and the mistakes they made. And he said, imagine a guy was about to jump me. And what I ended up doing was, I did a judo thing, and I turned around and got him down on the ground. Now I have my hand on his neck, and I got him twisted. And the guy is screaming, let go of me, you're hurting me. The people that were there at the time understand, well, you tried to jump him. But what if you keep standing like that for a week and a month and a year and so forth, and new people walking all the time? Let go of him. Well, he tried to kill me before. Yeah, but let go. Look at the pain he's in. You understand? As it gets harder and harder, just on a human being basis, to defend your actions, even though you're correct, and even though you're 100% right. The minute you let go, it'll try to kill you again. But that was the situation in which Israel found itself. And so Golda Meir, who was a good talker, and all of her friends, Abi Ben, had a hard time making the case that the Europeans cannot see why. Not only the Europeans, in late 1971, there was a famous visit of African leaders. The Organization of African Unity was around that time. The Third World was getting on its legs. Didn't mean anything. They're all dysfunctional. But at the level of political, shall I say, prestige, at that time the African Unity looked like they were really going to lead their country somewhere. Now they didn't, but it looked like they were. So the presidents of Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Zaire. President Zaire was a dictator of the Congo. We were talking about Mobutu, I think. So Israel invited them to come to Israel where Israel could explain their position, and maybe they could tell the Arabs to make peace with Israel. It boomeranged, because they went there and they heard everything and said like this, get out of the Sinai, get out of the territory, you're occupying other people's territory. What we can say then, and even today, I'm sorry to say, is when it comes to diplomacy, Egypt totally outclasses Israel. That's just an interesting fact. If you ever study the subject, it's an interesting one, but a depressing one. Egypt, there's a lot of bad things going, but their diplomats are great, and they've always outclassed Israel. And they were able to make the case, for example, in Africa, in spite of all the good that Israel had done there, that we talked about in the past, and all the aid and help, and the fact that they got rid of all the diseases and so on and so forth, Israel is occupying African land. Because the Sinai Desert, if you choose to look at it that way, since it's part of Egypt, is African land. And they repeated that over and over again. They got the African leaders on their side, and the result is that by the time you get to the 73 war, in 73, all the African countries break relations with Israel. There's like one or two exceptions. Right? Now, they're big liars. They said to Golda Meir, we're kicking you guys out, leave the doctors. That's what they did. Leave the social workers who's showing us how to do the social work. Leave the therapists who's showing that, but everybody else should go. Right? Which means, you understand? So basically, that's a naked self-interest. And she said, no, we're pulling everybody. So all that simply indicates that Israel's position is that we have the right to occupy the land and all the rest of it. It may sell to a Jewish audience, it was hard to sell it to a European or other audience. This is unhealthy, obviously, for Israel. The Arabs make up a significant portion of the third world, and they're able to parlay this into the diplomatic isolation of Israel, which is true. It's changing a little bit now, lately. A little bit, but it's still basically true. After all, every week you read about another United Nations resolution will tell you that, the Western world doesn't belong to Israel and all that. Israel could not turn to the third world, and it couldn't turn to the second world. Second world was the communists. So when you have leaders like Idi Amin here and Indira Gandhi here and Brezhnev over there, who's there to talk to? You had an extremely hostile environment, which is totally understandable. So where can Israel turn for support, for aid? The guy who was the UN ambassador, Yosef Tigo, had a tough time, baby, in the UN of those years. Because every minute was another anti-Israel resolution, another delegitimation, and what can you do? And the Russians are experts at what they call disinformation, so they can always say, Israel's killing babies this week. They're poisoning wells next week. They're doing, no, I'm serious. They're doing the other things. Who caused the earthquake? The Mossad. It's kind of business. And you can laugh, but it's not be funny. I said it 100 times, I'll say it 200 times. If you go around the world, not here, go around the world, and the billions of people out there, and ask them who made 9/11. The Mossad, Israel. Don't you know that they warned their people to get out? It's got nothing to do with that it's a lie. It's what's out there. The Russians are good at that. So where can Israel go for support? I mean, they have a few dictators. Thanks a lot, No, I'm serious. This is true. Somoza, remember him? The General Nguyen in Burma. Who's this? Torrijos, remember these guys? Oh yeah. If that's your friends, it's a problem. There was only, in those days, there was only one address in the world where Israel could get a friendly reception, right? And that, of course, was Washington, D.C. Those years. But it's not so pushit, right? Because when you have one friend, it's a little dangerous. And Nixon, right? So, this is as good. This was the A level. This was as good as it gets. You understand? This is as good as it gets. And and they did get along. On the other hand, when you have only one address in the world, your whole existence relies on one friend. It's dangerous. It's like all your money in a single stock. If that friend, and he's a friend, asks you not to attack the enemy first on Yom Kippur, even though they're coming, you kind of have to listen, don't you? Right? This is the main reason why Israel didn't attack first. They could have, but they couldn't. Because by that time, their isolation is so extreme that they have only one place, and they can't get Nixon angry. And for American political purposes, Israel cannot be seen as the aggressors. This is not what Ben-Gurion used to boast about and have in mind when he said we established a Jewish state. He told General Marshall, said in 1947, said, I'm a general, you're going to lose the war, don't declare a state of Israel. At that time, America put pressure on him, and he said, no, we're going to do it anyway, because lo chashuv ma shagoyim omrim, chashuv ma sheyudim osim. Right? It's not important what they say, it's what we do. You could say that perhaps in 1947. You couldn't say that in 1972. You couldn't say that in 1973. Now, God bless the United States of America, but for Israel, has for basically all of its history depended on one friend. Bibi Netanyahu, as I know you know, because this is an audience that follows that, has been trying to diversify as best as he can. Okay? And that's why he's been with all these world leaders, right? He'll try anything, Okay? But that's the whole idea of the relationship with China, with that's China, right? And with India, and so forth and so on. I mean, I get it. He's right. But at the end of the day, there's only one reliable partner, right? Well, let's go to the next one. Maybe there's only one reliable partner, right? But he got to admit. Let's go to the next one. Sure works in funny ways. So I end tonight by asking you my eternal question: why are you wasting your time reading fiction? Good night. Again, if anybody is interested in the itinerary, you tell my daughter over here will give you copies, and take 3 papers at a time. Here's Elishev right to my right over here.